Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode we go behind the scenes of the making of one of the most infamous bad movies ever made in The Disaster Artist. Aspiring actor Greg Sestero, played by Dave Franco, meets the unusual and mysterious Tommy Wiseau, played by James Franco, at an acting class, and they form an unlikely friendship. Moving in with Tommy in LA, they struggle to try and make it into Hollywood, so Tommy decides to create his own self-financed independent script, The Room, with himself and Sestero in the lead roles. But as the production falls further behind thanks to Tommy's behaviour and inexperience in front and behind the camera, their friendship becomes strained as the film they're making inches towards notoriety. In 2003, Tommy Wiseau unleashed The Room, his own self-financed vanity project that was released in one cinema in LA for 2 weeks. But despite that, it quickly garnered an infamous reputation and refused to disappear, and that's only built over the years as it became more and more infamous among bad movie fans. It's quickly garnered a status as being the Citizen Kane of bad movies, built up over the years over the course of countless midnight screenings, airings on Adult Swim on April Fool's Day, and many internet reviews. And I'm gonna have to sheepishly admit that I hadn't actually seen The Room before I saw The Disaster Artist. Now, I know what you're probably thinking here. Matthew, you do a show called Bad Movie Beatdown. Surely you must have seen The Room. Here's the thing, I was certainly very familiar with The Room. I know all the memes that have come out of it. I've certainly seen all my friends review it, and I've seen the film via their reviews. But I hadn't seen it in isolation. Because Wiseau self-distributed the film, he didn't sell it on internationally to other distributors outside of Spain. That was because no one wanted to pay the ridiculous prices that he charged for it. And as such, the only way you could actually see The Room legally in the UK was at the midnight screenings that would normally be held by the Bristol Bad Film Club or the Prince Charles Theatre. And many fans of The Room will tell you that that's not the ideal way of watching the movie for the first time. Really, you have to see it in isolation, because those screenings are as much about the sort of ritual of it, of dressing up in the tuxedos and throwing plastic spoons at the screen whenever you see a picture frame that has spoons in it, or throwing around footballs. It's mostly about the sort of audience participation element, more so than maybe the film itself by this point. And so really you need to see the film by itself. And so what I did was that I decided that the best way of reviewing The Disaster Artist, once I became aware that I was that I would try to see it from both perspectives, because this is a mainstream Hollywood movie, and obviously it's going to play to people who may not have even heard of The Room before. So I figured I was in an interesting position. So I've now seen The Room, but I saw it after The Disaster Artist. So I can fairly comfortably say that I can represent both sides here. I can tell how the fans of the film will react to it, but also people who are completely new to this material. But I wasn't completely unfamiliar with the film because I read the book. Yes, while the film was in production, I actually got my hands on a copy of Greg Sestero's book, and I absolutely love it. It is really hysterical to read, and not only is it a really in-depth account of the making of The Room, very blow by blow, and has lots of terrific anecdotes in there, but it's also a fascinating portrait between the relationship between Wiseau and Sestero, and this really built my expectations and anticipation for the movie, because there is a lot of great material here, and I'm happy to report that the film more than lives up to my expectations. I think the most difficult part about translating The Disaster Artist to the screen is how to portray Tommy Wiseau, because he's such an unusual, idiosyncratic person that it's very easy to lapse into caricature. Any fan of The Room can go, "Oh, hi Mark," but it can't simply be an impression. It has to feel like a person, no matter how odd. And Franco, who plays him, and was identified by Wiseau as being one of the most ideal candidates for the part, he is fantastic in this movie because he really brings Wiseau to life. And that's even more difficult when you realise that this film operates primarily, first and foremost, as a comedy, so Wiseau is very much seen through this lens of a comedic figure. It's difficult to walk that balance of playing up the side of Tommy that is inherently funny, this fish out of water character trying to operate in Hollywood in his own individual way. What James Franco has done has realised that there is a certain element of him that is kind of similar to Wiseau, because Franco also directs this movie, and Franco is already quite a prolific director. He's very much got this sort of outsider streak to him. He's always following up his own sort of individual artistic endeavours. He's done a number of previous book adaptations. I have to admit, I've seen some of them and wasn't particularly impressed by them because they're very much film school projects that probably wouldn't have been released if it weren't for the fact that they were made by an A-list actor. But from that perspective, him and Wiseau really aren't all that different from each other, or at least in my opinion. I think he has a lot of compassion for Wiseau. I think there is a lot of genuine affection for Wiseau and his creation running all the way through the movie. But I think that allows him to really inhabit Wiseau properly. And there were a couple of moments early on where I was worried that they were going to make an exaggeration of him, that it was going to be simply Franco putting on the voice. The film portrays Wiseau a little differently from the book. While Wiseau can be presented as sometimes quite generous, quite inadvertently amusing, like he is in the film, in the book there is this element of maybe something sinister about him because of his mysterious background. I was slightly disappointed. The comparisons made in the book to Tom Ripley from The Talented Mr. Ripley were not there, especially because that was a major crux of the production of the film, because Sestero takes Wiseau to see it, and he sees the film, and that becomes a major inspiration for The Room, to the point where he named one of the characters after Matt Damon, which he mangled as Mark Damon, hence the character of Mark. That's very briefly covered in a line of dialogue in the movie, that comparison to Talented Mr. Ripley, but otherwise it's not really concentrated on in the film adaptation, unfortunately. However, even though it views Wiseau through a softened lens, it's still a very accurate portrayal of what happened behind the scenes of The Room. I don't know how you'd be able to change that, because it's so much of why that film is what it is, and what also made the book so compelling. And if you read the book, you know that Wiseau can be very difficult and demanding and extremely obstinate. People would ask him to approach things in a more conventional way, but he remained steadfast to how he was committed to going about those problems, and he'd even be somewhat hectoring on the set, especially with relation to Juliette Danielle, who's played in the film by Ari Graynor. The film doesn't shy away from that big fight that occurs around the shooting of their sex scene. That is incorporated into the movie, and they don't try and file off the rougher edges of Wiseau in that way. But the film does generally try to frame him as someone who is very passionate about what he's doing, even if he's maybe a little clueless in some respects, and he doesn't really fit in. But the film tries to portray him as someone who has spent a long time trying to break into Hollywood, and he's got this frustration because he wants to mould himself as this all-American hero, but everyone else around him sees him as the villain. He doesn't want to be that character, and so he gets his chance to try and mould himself into that archetype. And what the film does that I think makes the character of Wiseau work is that it manages to go underneath the vanity of Wiseau, that secrecy and the dyeing his hair, and any time that a character asks, "What's your accent? How old are you? Where do you really come from?" you can see the pain that's sort of etched on James Franco's face. And at that point, Tommy Wiseau becomes human. But just as important is the portrayal of Greg Sestero, because their friendship is very much the focal point of the movie. We view Tommy through his perspective. He's very much the straight man to James Franco's far larger performance, and in that respect, the casting of Dave Franco is actually inspired to a certain extent, I think. We first see Sestero at the beginning of the movie. He's this very young actor, but he's not really confident in himself, and what he sees in Tommy is this unusual charisma that has drawn so many people towards him ever since The Room started to become popular. That sort of allure about Tommy, because he sees in him someone who is uninhibited and fearless, and we know that's because Tommy doesn't always play by societal norms, but he thinks he can learn something from Tommy, that this relationship that they develop between each other will be to each other's mutual benefit, and they find in each other a confidence, because Tommy is very much, if you want to do something, you have to go out and chase it, you have to go out and pursue it. And certainly from Tommy's perspective, Sestero is his only ally. He's the only one that's on his side as he's chasing his ambitions. That's why he's so close to him, but it's also why Sestero can actually reason with him. He's the only one that can actually get through to Tommy when he is being so difficult on set. And because of that pulling between both sides, in that Tommy is to some extent a mentor figure early on in the movie, but later on Sestero is the one that's more trying to keep Tommy in balance. You've got this very sort of brotherly relationship that I think is amplified by the casting of real-life brothers in these roles. I think that really gives you an idea of the sort of relationship that is developed between these two characters, and certainly why Tommy views the relationship with his girlfriend Amber, played by Alison Brie in the film, as a threat. He looks at them and he sees someone who is pulling his only friend out of the world. It's sort of meant to parallel, in some respects, what's happening in the plot of The Room. This anger starts building up behind him, and this, because he just feels that Sestero is betraying his trust to a certain extent. He's given him this opportunity with his film, even though Sestero, over the course of the movie, he begins to somewhat resent this film that they're making together. They go into LA making a pact that they'll always be by each other's side, and then that becomes a massive burden that just keeps building up and building up. When it comes to the production of The Room, you can tell that the filmmakers have made every effort to recreate it as much as possible. There are very easy reasons why they did this. The first is that they know this movie will be watched by people who are extremely familiar with The Room, have watched it many, many times, and know all of its intricacies, but at the same time will also be watched by people who have never seen The Room. And so having these very, very detailed recreations serves both purposes. It satisfies those fans of The Room, but if you haven't seen it, because of the amount of just small details included here, and the fact that there are scenes recreated shot by shot that even show you them side by side before the credits roll, that if you've never seen The Room, you'll still completely understand why the film is considered to be so bad. And so this actually works substantially in the film's favour. And the film doesn't cover all the elements of the production that the book did, which is totally understandable. The book has so much information in it that it's more than a film could really portray, but it does pick out the juiciest anecdotes and recreates them. And I think once the movie reaches the point where they're actually making The Room, I think that's really where it hits its comedic stride, because those stories, whether or not you're completely familiar with The Room, are hysterical. And certainly in the screening that I attended, there was a definite divide between people who had already seen or were familiar with The Room and those that were just familiar with The Disaster Artist and watching it for the first time. but both sets were laughing. The only real difference is that those in the know already knew where the movie was heading to begin with. And so I think the film will probably play best to fans because it's very clear that it's a total love letter to The Room. You can see that it's made up of people who genuinely adore that movie, and there's lots of cameos running all the way through it. This is the kind of film that opens with celebrity testimonials appearing as themselves, talking about The Room as if it were a great piece of movie making, as something that people are discussing for years, which they are. If you're a listener of the How Did This Get Made podcast, every single one of the hosts appears in this movie. Paul Scheer plays The Room's DP, Jason Mantzoukas plays one of the reps who owns the studio that Wiseau films in, and June Diane Raphael plays one of the actresses that is actually in the movie. And so they're all incorporated here. She actually has, I'd say, the most screen time, and he probably makes the most impression. Elsewhere, you've got other actors who are playing the performers who are in the room, such as Josh Hutcherson, Ari Graynor, Jackie Weaver. But I think the real standout among the crew of The Room, as it's seen in the film, is Seth Rogen, who plays the script supervisor, Sandy, who is very memorable if you've read the book, and the arguments that he would get into were so... And in the film, he's kind of the character that points out what the audience would be reacting to in the scenes that they're shooting. They very much puts what the common complaints of The Room are onto this character. So they'll be filming the scene where Wiseau laughs at an anecdote that isn't actually funny, and he's the sort of person who'll be watching this on the monitor and looks up and goes, "Wait, why is he laughing at this?" And the character is played in a lower register than Rogen usually does, and he's mostly reactive to Wiseau. Rogen is actually excellently cast in this part. He and Franco play off each other very well, as they should. They've appeared in numerous films together. In its third act, the film does have some deviations and inventions. There's a backstory added and a cameo behind the whole story of Sestero having to shave off his beard, but these changes are largely to build up a more dramatic relationship between Sestero and Wiseau, that the anger and resentment eventually builds up a head of steam. This conflict between the two characters, I think it works for the story the film is trying to tell, because this isn't a documentary, it's telling a version of this story. I think I was just bothered by it because I knew that wasn't necessarily how events played out in real life, but it's to facilitate the film's ending, which stretches past the point where the book finished, but I think it would need to feel more satisfying, and it tries to incorporate the film's ongoing legacy, and I think it does so in a way that's really emotionally satisfying, especially for the portrayal of Tommy in the film. I think that scene, it really works well as the climax of the movie, and I think it really shows the sweetness of the movie ultimately overall, and really how it approaches Wiseau as not really being a failure, but more of a success. He managed to accomplish something on his own terms. He managed to chase his dream, and he accomplished that fame that he aspired to. It wasn't the route that he expected. He thought he was making a Tennessee Williams style melodrama and ended up making something that would be a comedy, but it's also a celebration of the power of movies and seeing films with an audience and the effect that they can have on people. Although The Disaster Artist isn't quite up to the book, but it would be a very hard ask, it is still terrific entertainment. I really enjoyed this movie a lot. There is a lot of big laughs, and I think that James Franco delivers one of the most memorable performances of the year. If this movie really piques your interest, absolutely read the book. It is a must read, but also I think you should definitely see The Room. I think if you're a film fan, you owe it to yourself at least once to see it. But as for The Disaster Artist, I think I'm going to be seeing that many, many more times. The Disaster Artist is a hilarious look at one of the worst films ever made, but it also has a great deal of heart behind it too. Although it is very affectionate to The Room, because of director James Franco's meticulous recreation of its scenes, it will be appreciated by both its hardcore fans and newcomers, even if it does border on the overly referential because of its cameo-laden cast. In front of the camera, James Franco's portrayal of Ty Wiseau avoids becoming a caricature by finding the vulnerability underneath the outsider, while he and his brother Dave do a convincing job of depicting the pivotal friendship of Wiseau and Sestero. While it's not quite on the same level as the book it's based on, and will likely play best to fans of The Room, it's a hugely entertaining and surprisingly sweet look at following your dreams and finding success in failure. If you like this review, then throw a football over to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, and you're my favourite customer. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.
Hi, doggy.